Now, do you want me to look at any particular place?
Just kind of look this, basically me here. Okay, this is Jory Vandenberg, the 388 Fighting Wing historian. I'm currently conducting a series of interviews of individuals from the 388th Bombardment Group Heavy. I'm here at the 63rd Annual 388th Bomb Group Reunion here in Savannah, Georgia. Today is 1 September 2012, and I'm currently interviewing the following individual.
My name is Joseph Rosenbaum.
Okay, Mr. Rosenbaum. And where was your hometown? Where did you grow up?
My hometown was New York City. I actually was born in Lower Manhattan and lived there till I was 11.
Okay.
And then moved to Brooklyn, where I lived until I moved to Queens, and then went into the service from Queens in 1942.
Okay. And so what was your what job did you end up getting in the service, in the military?
Well, initially I was in infantry. I went through infantry basic 6 months as a rifleman.
Okay.
And after completing that, an aviation cadet crew, selection crew, visited the base, and I was recruited for the Air Force. I took the exam and scored fairly well, and they asked if I was interested in transferring out, and of course I was, and became an aviation cadet.
Okay.
And that was, I believe, in the beginning of 1943, early in 43, I transferred from the infantry, 9th Infantry Regiment, actually, at Camp Croft, South Carolina, transferred from there and went to Nashville for classification and examination for suitability for flight training.
Okay. All right, but let me just kind of back up real quick. When you first enlisted, you enlisted in the infantry, or you just enlisted in the army?
I was drafted.
Oh, you're drafted.
When there's nobody left but the 19-year-olds and the 40-year-olds were the last draft. And I actually tried to enlist, but they said if I did, they would have to draft a married man from where I lived in Queens, New York. And in order to save him, I said, okay. They said, when you get into the service, you'll probably be able to do what you want, but why don't you fulfill the quota for our neighborhood in Queens by being drafted? And this was, I believe, October or November of 1942. Okay. So I was actually drafted and assigned to the infantry for basic training, to the 9th Infantry Regiment in South Carolina.
Okay, in November of 42.
Right.
And so they sent you down there to South Carolina.
Right.
To start out training the infantry, and so for about the first 6 weeks?
6 months, I completed the complete training, preliminary and advanced, as a rifleman in a rifle company.
Okay, and then around April, the air.
Yes, around March or April of 1943, I guess. Yeah, 43. Or was it 40? No, yes, 1943, I was transferred to the Army Air Corps as an aviation cadet,
All right. Now, did you have a college degree or any college?
No, I had 2 years of college, though, which was then a requirement for aviation cadets, which was later waived.
Okay.
And they sent kids to college, actually, before they started the actual cadet training. No, I had actually about 2.5 years of college. Okay. I started college at 16. I was pretty young and actually worked for about a year as an engineering aide before I was drafted.
Okay. All right. Well, cool. All right. So you got selected for aviation training. And where did you first go when you did that?
Well, I went to Nashville, which was the Aviation Classification Center.
Okay.
You went through a battery of tests, physical and mental, and then they selected you. Either you were eliminated as unsuitable for flying training. I forgot, it was called ARMA. Adaptability Regarding Military Aviation, ARMA. It was a battery of tests, about 3 days. And if you passed that, you were then designated either bombardier, pilot, or navigation training. Okay. And I was selected for navigation.
Alrighty.
And I protested. You were allowed to have one appeal. I appealed that I want pilot training. And they gave me about a week to sit and consider. But I still insisted. They finally did send me out to pilot pre-flight school.
Okay. And so where did you go initially for pilot school?
I went to Maxwell Field, Alabama for pre-flight training for pilots. And then from there I went to Decatur, Alabama, 65th Flying Training Detachment. They had civilian instructors. I believe the school actually run by Delta Airlines, at that time Decatur, Alabama, and several others in the southeast.
Right, yes.
And that's where I had primary flight training for about 30 hours. That is, I soloed very early, but was also eliminated before I had my advanced phase. They decided I was a dangerous flyer, dangerous to myself and other people.
Alrighty. And so then,
but I did get to do about 30 hours solo and dual flying in a Stearman. Very enjoyable.
Okay. And that was down at Decatur.
Right, Decatur, Alabama.
All right. So at what point, what date, time did they determine that you were not qualified?
It was just before transition. The training was divided into two halves, and the first of which you soloed and learned to cope with stalls, spins, and do a few maneuvers like chandelles and
all that fun stuff,
and flying eights, lazy eights, and things like. So it was about at the end of the first period they decided I shouldn't take the advanced part of it.
Okay, all right, and so they decided to send you off to
navigation school, which was my original designation by the psychiatrist, that I was best suited to be a navigator.
Okay.
So their judgment apparently was a good one.
Yeah, they knew what they were talking about at the time. All right, so where did you go for navigation school? Do you remember the date, about the time you started?
When I went to navigation school? Let me see. I was sent back to Nashville first, before they sent me to a navigation school, where the initial classification was done. And we spent about a week there. And I think it was the fall of 1943, because I soloed in July in the Stearman before my 21st birthday, which was July 26, 1943. And so it was in the fall of 43
you finally
that I came to Selman Field, I believe, that called in Louisiana, in Monroe, Louisiana. And there I went to pre-flight school again for navigation rather than pilot pre-flight school, which was more heavily emphasized the mathematics and things you might need in navigation school. So the preparation there was primarily for advanced navigation. It was a pre-flight school in Selman Field. And then we were sent from Selman Field after about 2 months to gunnery school at Fort Myers, Florida. And we spent, I think, a month there learning to take apart a 30 caliber machine gun and put it back together, all blindfolded. So you're supposed to be able to do this in the air under very stressful conditions. And then we returned to Selman Field and took advanced navigation school with a lot of flying for about 2 or 3 months. So in April of 44, I was graduated, and I never was commissioned because I was kind of a non-military cadet. So they made me a flight officer, which was a warrant grade. And I wasn't commissioned until I got overseas and in combat, actually.
You think that might have had because you didn't have a bachelor's degree from college?
Oh no, had nothing to. It was, I would do stupid things like if they were marching as a group into physical training, I would exit halfway there and go to the PX for a beer or something, and then rejoin them after the physical training. And I went undetected for some time, but finally somebody found out I was missing and decided that was not conduct becoming a commissioned officer to be, And I actually had sort of a summary court-martial for it, and a group of officers, one of whom was a returnee from the 8th Air Force, looked like a 23-year-old major who was a navigator, conducted the court-martial or summary of infractions of cadet rules or honesty or something. Anyway, he had his shoes off and his stocking feet up on the table. It seemed to get a big kick out of my behavior. He had returned from missions when there was 25 in Europe, so I guess he was kind of a free spirit then, being a major at a young age, and said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I'd really rather be a staff sergeant." So he laughed at that, and anyway, they gave me some walking tours or some kind of punishment, he said, and go back to training. But when it came time for commissioning, they decided I wasn't worthy of a commission.
Okay.
And ironically, that meant I got more pay because enlisted men or non-commissioned officers, when they served overseas, got 20% bonus, whereas an officer only got a 10% bonus. And while the base pay was the same for flight officers and second lieutenants, I got 20% when overseas, they only got 10. So I was actually getting paid almost a first lieutenant's pay from the time I arrived, while the rest of the crew, including the pilot, was getting less money. And the rule in the Army is you can never have your pay reduced except for major infractions of some rule, but I didn't have major infractions. So when I finally did get a commission, I was still getting first lieutenant's pay as a second lieutenant.
Okay.
You know? So in a way, being bad worked out for my benefit. You know?
Okay. That is funny. That is funny. Okay, so you finished your navigator school.
Right, and then I
what
was
happened?
assigned to join a crew which had been practicing together, except for a navigator, at Drew Field in Florida, Tampa, Florida.
Okay.
About April of '44, I joined this crew, whose pilot was Majeska, and they had been training for about 6 weeks, flying training, ground school, and I joined them as a navigator.
Alrighty.
And that's where we stayed till we were sent to Savannah, Hunter Field, to be sent overseas. And Hunter was where you picked up a B-17, usually from Boeing in Seattle, or Douglas or Lockheed, who were then producing the B-17s under license, because by the spring of '44, Boeing had converted to B-29 production and farmed out the B-17s. And our first B-17 actually was built by Douglas, the one we used, rather than Boeing. Okay. So in Florida, we had what we called operational training, and we came, before we left for Hunter Field here in Savannah, our bombardier had an appendix problem, so he left us, so we showed up here minus a bombardier in Hunter Field, Savannah, waiting for a B-17, which never arrived. So ultimately they sent us to New York, where we boarded the Aquitania, a huge Cunard liner, to go overseas with an infantry division, 15,000 men and their equipment aboard. And here about 20 of us came with our Class A uniforms, carrying tennis rackets and the booze of the infantry up the gangplank. They were waiting for us actually at port. You know. Okay. Interestingly enough,
excuse me real quick. What was the date of that? Do you remember the date of when you showed up?
When we showed up for the Aquitania?
Yes, sir.
We left port. It must have been probably in July, sometime early July. Of 1944. Okay. I'll bet early July or late June. Okay. Interestingly enough, my uncle had gone overseas in World War I on the Aquitania, that same ship. My grandfather in 1932, when I was 10, was on that ship, went to England en route to the Holy Land, where he stayed, ultimately to live in what later became Israel in 1948, but he migrated. Being a very religious man, he wanted to die in the Holy Land, and so he went over on that same ship to England, ultimately to Palestine. You know. Okay.
You know, that was a sister ship to the Lusitania.
I believe so.
And the Titanic.
I believe so.
They built 4 of them, and those.
Right. I believe so.
The last one was.
It was a real luxury liner in regular service.
Top of the.
But it was run by the British Navy. Then all the officers were British naval officers, and the crew was from the Navy.
All right, so that was July of '44. Right. So you sail across the Atlantic, and you show up. Where did you go into port?
In Gorrick, Scotland, Gorck. Okay. That's the way they pronounce it, Gorrick. It was in it was like a fjord, except they called it a firth. The Scots call them, the Norwegians call them fjords. And we went in there because it was protected from possible attack by German aircraft, since it very steep palisades on both sides, but it took forever to unload it because there was no dock there. They just anchored there, and the little tenders took us off. Took about 3 days to unload the ship, 15,000 people. Interestingly enough, aboard was the entertainment group Spike Jones, and his had a really interesting kind of a band, very famous at the end, and a movie star who was the it girl, that was her name, named Ann Sheridan, who happened to be an acquaintance of our co-pilot and Bob Vortman.
Wowzers.
They both were from Denton, Texas. She had worked in his father's bookstore and knew him quite well. So she planted a kiss on him, and you can imagine the crowd. This was the #1 sex star in Hollywood at the time, kissing our co-pilot.
Cool.
So the crowd really went up. And so she was going to entertain in England aboard that same ship, as well as this Spike Jones band, and 2 blonde twin starlets who were singers in front of Spike Jones.
Oh, by the way, what could you identify all of the individuals that was on your crew?
Sure. At that time, there was the Majeska, called the Majeska crew. There was William Majeska, who was the pilot, Bob Vortman, the co-pilot, and myself, the navigator. We had no bombardier, who was back nursing his appendix somewhere. And then we had somebody named Brown, was the flight engineer, top turret gunner. I remember his last name, I've forgotten his first name. We had 2 waist gunners, one named Clark, the other Yoder. And we had a ball turret gunner, Shorty, of course, being very small to fit in the ball, Coughlin, Coughlin, and a tail gunner whose last name was Caspar, Caspar. I believe that was 9 people.
Okay. All right. Okay, so you get off the boat, and then where'd they send you?
Yeah, we finally get on this little tender into Scotland, and then on a train down to Nettishall, actually to Thetford, I believe, and then trucked into Nettishall, 2 or 3 miles from Thetford.
All right. And about how long were you there? That you finally got a bombardier connected up with you?
Let's see, who did we get as a... Oh, yeah, we got a bombardier named Stafford, Stafford.
Okay.
I'd say within a week or 2 of the pilots were getting orientation flights by themselves, and then finally, as a crew, we went up for orientation.
Okay.
And Stafford came just before our first mission, but quite interestingly, the night before our first mission, Mr. Brown, the flight engineer, decided he didn't want to go. So we had to search very quickly for a flight engineer, and we all said, of course, we all don't want to go, but he managed to stay with it. And unfortunately, they put him in the kitchen for 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, on display, which I thought was cruel, just scrubbing up. He was dishwasher, pot scrubber, and whatnot, all the rest of the time we were there. And we moved the crew. The waist gunner, Brown, became the flight engineer on our first mission. And let's see, did we replace him or not? I can't recall right now who did we get to replace him, if anybody, as an enlisted man. I just don't recall who. I know who shifted positions and took these but I can't remember whether we ever got a replacement for Mr. Brown. But we must have, because all the crews were virtually the same size. Occasionally there was an 11-man crew because they stuck a pilot in the tail gunner position if you were in a lead position in the formation. His seat was occupied usually by commanding officer of the mission, and he would designate up and down things like signals in a football game of what was happening in the formation and relaying it to the cockpit. So occasionally there were fewer than 10 enlisted men when a co-pilot became a tail gunner, so to speak.
Okay. All right, so do you remember your first mission, your very first mission? And when it was? When did you do your first combat
I
mission?
think the very first mission was actually down to Bordeaux in France, as I recall.
Do you remember the date?
Sometime in late July, early August.
Okay. The 44.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I believe I was a little resentful because they warned the people in Bordeaux we were coming, so the Luftwaffe could, vector a lot of airplanes on there, get ready for us.
Right. Well, wasn't that kind of a typical thing anyway, that we would
Yeah, if you were
send it
going
just to kind of make the people
a French target, right?
stay out of the plants because we're going to come bomb.
Exactly.
Stay home.
Yeah.
Part of it was kind of like.
But of course, they were ready for you when you came there, so the
disadvantage.
greeting was not so pleasant.
Yeah. Well, I remember that. Well, anyway. Okay, so you go down to Bordeaux. How did that mission turn out?
Yeah, it was.
They knew you were coming. So.
It wasn't a heavily fortified place, so I thought it was rather pleasant.
Okay. Do you remember what the target was specifically?
I think it was shipping and docks and
Trying to get
whatnot.
the
Right.
dock and kind of,
Might have been some
port.
submarine pens there. I don't think
I
so.
think that's what my recollection was. There were submarine pens there too.
Those were more up north from there. As I remember, the British mosquitoes used to go in very low because they had garages for those subs with tons of concrete above them. So these mosquitoes would come in just on the water and lob their bombs into the entrance.
Yeah, skip them in there.
Right.
That was the only way to do it. Okay.
Right.
Okay, so you by early August of 44, you were basically in the full combat mode.
Right.
And then how many ultimate missions did you get?
Ultimately,
Ultimate.
35.
Okay, so you got your third.
Right, but that was with a different crew, basically.
Oh, by the way, the first plane, what was the first plane you got? Apparently you had two different planes?
At least.
2 planes and 2
At
crews?
least 2.
Okay.
I can't remember. It just gave you a plane. I think it was an F model. I remember that.
Okay.
Rather than, didn't have the chin turret.
Okay, did it have a name or anything? Did y'all,
If it had.
Was it your
I
plane or was
no,
y'all
it
borrowed
was
somebody
they
else?
just gave us that plane. In fact, I guess the first 4 or 5 missions we had several different planes.
okay, other people's planes?
We finally got a G model, I think, which we got to name. It was
Okay.
a new plane about our 6th or 7th mission.
Right.
No, it was later than that, actually. We got our own airplane.
Okay.
And it was no longer Majeska. It had been by then in the hospital. So what happened actually was Majeska came down with an appendix problem after our 7th mission.
Okay,
And Timberlake, who ultimately became our co-pilot, replacing Vortman, who we were sitting around with no pilot, so we weren't getting any missions in. And by that time, Vortman had checked out as pilot. He'd been a co-pilot, never went to 4-engine school, but was good enough, so
Okay.
said that he could have a crew. And Timberlake, who flew with Locker, was hit on their 4th mission, I believe, at Politz or Mertzburg, somewhere. Anyway, so he'd been in the hospital a while, and his crew had, Mr. Locker's crew, got another co-pilot. So there he was, coming out of the hospital with no crew to go to. Here we were looking for a co-pilot with Majeska in the hospital with appendectomy. Vortman was pilot. We were socially very close.
okay.
Vortman, Timberlake, and myself at Drew Field in Florida while we were training. So we sat around like Mickey Rooney and so, why don't we put on a show, you know how those movies used to be,
Yeah.
and said, why don't we form a crew, you know? So the 3 of us said, sure, let's do that. But here were 2 co-pilots, so amusingly, they said, oh, we'll just have 2 pilots on this crew, equally powerful. That was the thought, that there would be no pilot, just 2 co-pilots and a navigator. And luckily, here came Algernon G. Henderson, a bombardier who had just returned from a 1-month leave in the States.
Okay.
He had a deal where then, if you had 20 missions in, you were offered a chance to go home for a month, you see,
Okay.
and then come back and do 20 more. That was a big
Right.
mistake.
That was the choice you could have. but
Right, so
otherwise, stick in-
Algernon
okay.
decided he was alive and he was going home, And within 30 days, most of them were drunk for the first 25 and then discovered they were going back to combat for another 20, Anyway, Algernon, who already had a distinguished flying cross and several air medals, and here he was, a New Yorker, so I cottoned to him, and he liked us, so we formed a crew with 2 co-pilots, Vortman and Timberlake. Timberlake, who had been wounded and had his Purple Heart, and Algernon G. Henderson, who had formerly flown with another crew, had 20 missions, and myself as navigator. And then we had the enlisted men were all the ones I named at Drew Field, with the exception of Brown, and somebody else no, I don't think we took anybody else in. Don't know. Anyway, that was the officers were those 4, and we formed a crew. And of course, we all had different numbers of missions. Timberlake only had 4, we had 7, so we were starting out uneven, but we managed to stay together until Timberlake was hit again, but this time rather seriously on our 32nd mission, his, I believe, 26th, when he wounded. We had several wounded, but he most severely, and never made it back to our base, And so landed, and it was December, bitter storms. Luckily, a P-47 heard our pleas and took us right onto the runway of this, I've forgotten which base, it was a different bomb group. We landed there, and Timberlake got into the hospital and was finally sent back to Fort Benjamin Harrison for his hospitalization. And he was in the hospital a good long time. That was his second Purple Heart. He said he's not flying anymore with the 8th Air Force, any other Air Force. And we flew the last 3 missions. There were actually 4 of us, as I remember, who flew, 4 or 5, who flew all 35 missions. Namely, Vortman, myself, among the officers, I believe were the only, because Henderson only flew the 20 missions and then left the crew. So we never replaced him. We've got a Togolier, one of our waist gunners, Doc Yoder, the old man of the crew. He was 33 or something, much older than me. He came up to the nose and toggled off the bombs. So we flew our last 3 with Vortman, myself, a pickup co-pilot who I can't remember, and Doc Yoder as our Togolier. So we were only about 9 men in that crew. And we finished up, as I say, 4 of us did all 35. The radio operator, Billy Wells, who died last June, and Clark, the flight engineer, and myself and Vortman. But the others, minor wounds here and there.
And
so that takes us to just about January or February of 1945. We're all through.
And you're done.
And Timberlake's in the hospital still. And in order to stay in the theater, you had to have an assignment. And we were wondering how Timberlake was going to do. So Vortman and I and Brown and Clark and Willie Wells decided we would volunteer for these Kodak assignments, the 3rd Bomb Division, to become a weather reconnaissance crew for the 3rd Bomb Division. And we were assigned to a fighter base. It was actually that to house us. We were at a fighter field very close to London, and they had 3 brand new B-17s stripped down for weather recon, and a normal fighter group was there, and then these 8 or 9 P-51s with ex-bomber pilots checked out of the P-51 so they could advise the command at 3rd Division whether the weather was suitable for a bombing mission, because they'd all flown tours of duty in bombers, completed them, and here they could fly very rapidly in P-51s and jut around and see what the possible routes might be. And the commanding general, General Partridge, also had a P-51 that he would inspect the formations with. So it was a lot of fun for some of the pilots, and including Vortman, who checked out on a P-51 as well as flown these stripped down B-17s. So the routine was the B-17s took off 3 hours before the mission, and flew about 1/3 of the route. And I, as a navigator, primarily would measure winds at every thousand we would climb, 1,000 feet at a time, and radio these winds back to headquarters, and cloud cover, sometimes we had a meteorologist with us, and the plane was beautiful because it was warm, since there were no bomb bays and no gun turrets. All we had were 2 guns in the rear, because at that light weight we could run away from anything, but so our tail would be, the 2 guns would discourage any fighters from chasing us. And that would take place 3 hours very early in the morning before a mission, and 1 hour before the mission the P-51s would take off and fly the same route to see if there'd been any major changes in the weather, and then they decide, yeah, the mission will go. And we were called Kodak, was our code name.
Kodak was the code name.
Right.
Okay.
And I stayed with that until about April, and I saw the war was ending, and I wanted to get home. And so I've forgotten the commanding officer's name of Kodak. So I went to see him. He said, well, you go down to Southampton, and if you can find a way to get home, go home, because I can't write any orders for you now. Things are hectic, you know. So I went down to Southampton and ran into, who was it? Wendell Wilkie, who was running, his son was drinking in the same bar. He was a presidential candidate, and he was a lieutenant senior grade in the Navy. He said, well, you could, there's a convoy going out in about 2 weeks that I'm with. He was on a destroyer escort for anti-sub work. So he found me a place. I went back and said, Lieutenant Wilkie in the Navy says I can get on board with this group in the convoy. They've got a space for me. That's how I went home. You know.
Okay. So then you were done.
That was it.
Is there any, let me ask you real quick, were you involved in any Operation Aphrodite missions?
No, except I knew that several of the pilots slept next to me, and I wondered why these highly polished paratroop boots were doing under the beds, and they never seemed to be in any briefing I was with, you know. I said, what do you do, you know? And finally I wormed it out of him that he was getting 2 missions credit every time he bailed out of one of these B-17s over England. There was a chute in the front, and they were war-weary. B-17s loaded with TNT, you know. And what the hell was his name? Wiener, I think, or something. He seemed very happy about collecting 2 missions every time he took off. You know. That's how I learned about Aphrodite.
How incredibly dangerous that mission.
Right. They were pretty. In fact, Jack Kennedy's brother, Joe Kennedy, was killed on an Aphrodite mission.
That's right.
Flying for the Navy. You know.
That's right.
Yeah, that's how I learned about it. You know.
This might be another.
Is that your 350 or 330? You're like a doctor.
1545.
Right.
Okay. Anything else you'd like to add? Normally I would ask, what did you do after the war?
Oh, after the war, I went to Berkeley and majored in mathematics and became an applied mathematician at the RAND Corporation.
Okay. And how long did you do that?
And I taught some mathematics from elementary school all the way up to graduate school. I taught at every level mathematics and mathematical statistics. That's about it, except we formed an airline. That was quite interesting. On these, when I went to visit Timberlake in the hospital, a doctor came in and said, you're not doing anything, so he threw a bunch of letters at me to sign my name and say, for censorship. And then he found out from Timberlake that we had this airplane. And he had nurses who were recovering from pneumonia. So he said, could you fly these nurses up to Ireland so they could get some fresh milk and food? You could, Northern Ireland, you could get some of the, so we became, then the word got around that we had this nice airplane all fixed up like an airliner, and we started to get passengers. We would fly from our field, people would collect up, nurses as well as other people, and we'd go up to Langford Lodge, which was a Lockheed base in Belfast. So we became regular crossing. When we weren't flying weather recon, we'd go up to Ireland and other places. We had the use of the airplane, like we were rich people with a private B-17 to go to parties and whatnot. So that was kind of fun. See, we became known as the airline up to Lockheed Base in Belfast.
It's a private airline.
Yeah, pretty good. At the expense of the taxpayer, it cost about $1,000 an hour to keep a B-17 in the air. You know.
Great.
But we did load it up.
You
with a lot of
need to
passengers.
keep developing your skill level.
Right,
Keep it honed up.
Right.
All right. Well, listen, Mr. Rosenbaum, thank you very much for your
You're
time.
very welcome.
Let me go
Thank
off
you.
camera here.